Hi guys, Mr. Ridgway here with our next lesson, and it is finally time for World War I. As it said here, it is going to indeed be quite woeful. So, in this lesson, what we're going to be looking at here is we are going to, and I'm going to be doing a lot of talking through this, so this is probably going to be one of my longer episodes, is we are going to be briefly summarizing the events that lead to the outbreak of World War I, mostly in Europe. Second, we're going to look at the causes for why the U.S. gets into World War I, and then you guys will be spending quite a bit of time looking at how Woodrow Wilson's worldview really informed that decision for the U.S. to get involved. And then lastly, and you guys will get to kind of do this on your own, life for American soldiers on the Western Front. What I would like you to start out first is to be able to briefly summarize the events that get the U.S. into, what makes first the war break out in Europe. And we'll get to how the U.S. gets involved in that later. Okay, so what you're going to be doing here is explaining the start of World War I through the texted story of a high school fight. Okay, so you're going to be translating this essentially into teen speak. Okay, each country is going to represent a girl or a boy in the story of how World War I started, and we'll assume we just make it up that it's in a school. It doesn't necessarily have to be our high school. And you're going to try to echo in this story as many historical themes as you can. So like alliances can be gangs or groups or a certain posse that's following people around. Okay. Negotiations between countries, like how do they get into it, what happens, and you're going to try to do as many of those as you can. All right, the resources that you need are right here, okay, where it says resource, and then where you're going to write is going to be right here, and this link will be updated for you, and you'll be able to see everybody's story that we're writing at the same time. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and explain this information about what are the causes of World War I. And again, you don't have to take notes on this, but I'm using this to help you inform the story that you're going to write. Which I'm sure is going to be awesome. Okay, so what was the world like in 1914? So again, World War I starts for different people at different times. And so if we look here at the map of Europe, we can see that Germany, it looks a little bit different. Okay, there's also this weird country called Austria-Hungary and some other ones that really don't exist now. So where the world was, kind of at this point, using Africa here as an example, is it's divided a lot into large empires. And 1914 and World War I is the moment where we can say that Europe was really in more control of the world than at any other point. Okay, so if you look there at Africa, you can see there that the scramble for Africa had happened, and it had been deeply, deeply colonized by this point. You can see every country essentially owns a chunk of Africa, except for Ethiopia. It's the one that made it out of there. Okay, so if we think about that we're having a world divided up into empires, and along with those empires came a whole system of alliances that are essentially, as you can see by the cartoon that's depicted down there, going to help contribute to the cause of World War I. These empires are competing with another, both for colonies and also for resources, but then also you need to inject into that a whole host of cultural things, such as social Darwinism, racism, and then also what had been kind of a new and bubbling idea all the way since the 30 Years' War, which was nationalism. The idea that people are identifying with a nation. So if you put all those things together, social Darwinism, racism, and nationalism, you start to get this idea that you say certain, like Germans are more superior than to England or Anglos, or Franks are better than, and you can fill in any blank. Okay, so we're starting to get a very nasty system of competition that's going on. So what's the actual thing that happens that most people really point to, and that is the assassination of an Archduke, that is Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Okay, so again, this story is pretty well known, but I'll go ahead and summarize it for you here. Okay, so in Austria-Hungary, the heir to the throne was named Franz Ferdinand. Okay, and so Austria-Hungary at this time was although it sounds strange today, was actually a pretty powerful country, or rather countries, because I guess it's both combined. But one of the areas that they had at least a interest in taking over was Serbia, which was located right next door. And what had happened is that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was traveling around and visiting essentially a particular city, and he is assassinated by a group of Serbian extremists called the Black Hand. Now, this group of Serbian extremists called the Black Hand, they, again, are from Serbia. They're not from essentially Austria-Hungary, and they find the guy who did it. His name is Gavrilo Princip, and they torture him for quite a while, and they basically find out what they need to know. And as you can imagine, Austria-Hungary is pretty darn upset that their heir to the throne was just assassinated. Okay, so what they do is, even though Serbia wasn't entirely to blame for this, the Black Hand is kind of a complicated organization to describe. Austria-Hungary goes to Serbia and throws down an ultimatum. And they make basically essentially 10 demands, and most of them are so ridiculous, you can go look them up, that no country would pretty much ever agree to them. And some historians have rightly said that pretty much Austria-Hungary in this case might have just been looking for an excuse to fight. Now, as Austria-Hungary is starting to mobilize, what they do is they start to look to their friends and their ally, which was Germany at the time. And so they ask Germany, will you back us if we invade Serbia? And Germany gives them what is called the famous blank check. So if you don't know what happens when you give somebody a blank check, basically they can write any money amount that they want to on it. And so it's Germany essentially saying, go ahead and do what you want, we got your back. And indeed, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. And that's when things start to get very nasty. Serbia's ally at the time was Russia, under the direction of Tsar Nicholas II. And Russia, as they saw their ally Serbia starting to basically be threatened and then have declare war on it, begins to mobilize its armies. Okay, and again, Russia, huge military power, lots of people, those kind of things. This starts to then really complicate things. Okay, so why Germany then starts to panic, okay, is because Germany, when its planners were sitting down and thinking about this war that might happen, okay, they were very scared that if Germany had to go to war with Russia, okay, Russia was also allied with France. And what that would mean is that Germany, if a war were to break out, was going to be fighting a two-front war, which is not what they wanted. Okay, and so Germany definitely wanted to make sure that it mobilized first. Okay, and you can understand this here if you look at this map. Okay, so if we look here, you can see that Germany, if Russia all of a sudden declares war on Austria-Hungary and Germany, that means this war is going to break out. Okay, and also if France is an ally of Russia, that means they're going to be fighting another war over here. And a two-front war is never what you want because you have to split and divide your forces. And that's going to cause a lot of issues. So Germany wanted to make sure that it was going to be able to mobilize first before anybody else, if it even had to fight a two-front war. And so this has now become a problem for Germany. Okay? And so what happens? Well, we get the war on the Western Front. Okay, now we'll also break out on the Eastern Front, but my point here is to really focus on the Western Front because that's where eventually Americans are going to get involved. So what Germany decides to do is called the von Schieffen Plan, or the Sickle Plan, and it decides to attack France first. It really wants to take France out of the battle, or out of the war very, very quickly, and then once done with them, then deal with Russia, because they figured, and they were right, that it would take Russia a little bit longer to mobilize. Okay, so what they do is they attack France through Belgium, and it kind of looks like a big sickle on the map, which is why it gets that name. Okay, and then things get even more complicated because Belgium was allied with Britain. Okay, and the King of Belgium at this time, makes a very, very famous declaration like, "Belgium is not a highway," and pretty much the Germans used it as one. However, with Britain being allied with Belgium, that's now really complicated things because now Britain has to also declare war on Germany. Okay, and so what we get on from that point essentially is we have many European powers either at war with each other or allied with each other, and as they begin to clash, you can kind of see that there on the map. What we eventually get is both armies trying to outflank each other because, and we can talk about tactics here a little bit later and how that works. Because as they basically try to outflank each other, they start running basically left and right as far as they can. So on the map, why these arrows are going northward is because as they try to do that, they're basically racing towards the sea, where they have to stop. Okay, and so that's why we get the so-called race to the sea, because we're going to basically get some very nasty in through here trench lines that are going to develop. And from that point on, World War I just becomes a nasty slugfest. Okay, so cool. Not for them, but for our purposes here. So how does this alliance system look like that caused all of these problems? Well, on one side, you're going to have the Triple Alliance, which is going to be Germany, Austria-Hungary, and then later on, they add the Ottoman Empire. Okay, Italy will also be part of the Triple Alliance early on. However, just like in World War II, Italy will switch sides halfway through. Okay, then on the other side, you have the Triple Entente, which was Britain, France, Russia early on until they get knocked out of the war and kind of quit out of it halfway through, Italy later on, and then also the United States later on. Here's something that'll give you this idea of a video here that might help you explain this, but that's pretty much the gist of it. Okay? So again, what you're going to be doing here is you're going to be taking what you've learned now, and I'm going to go back here to this slide, and you're going to be taking this and turning it into a high school fight. So the best really the best stories are going to be the ones that are very sassy and channel your inner high school girl who's really frustrated through text messages, and guy who starts threatening through text messages, because boys and girls both fight. Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and click and go on, and I'm going to move on to the next thing. Okay, but if you need to pause the video here and go ahead and take care of that story, go ahead and do so. Alright, so what we're going to be looking at here, and I'm going to skip over this one kind of fast, is Woodrow Wilson's worldview and how we can see that that informs his want to eventually go into World War I. Okay, so the U.S. does formally enter World War I in 1917. Okay, you can see 1914, where it's quite a few years has been going on from that point. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to look at his speech. Okay, please be aware it is a quite in-depth and in some cases very nuanced and complicated speech. Again, Woodrow Wilson is this very kind of like high idealistic progressive thinker. So it is going to take you a little bit of time. Just don't get bogged down in it. And then you're just going to reflect on the questions that are here. Okay, so again, take care of this and then carry on here with the rest of the video. Alright, so for the rest of this video, what we're going to be looking at is the causes for the U.S. entrance into World War I. Okay, you guys are going to handle Woodrow Wilson. Let's talk about the U.S. getting into World War I. So, why does America fall or jump into this war? Okay, so here we go. Our essential question for this is, what factor besides a surprise attack can influence countries to declare war? So in the Spanish-American War, for instance, it was the attack on the Maine, which wasn't an attack, but that led to that problem in contribution to a whole host of other factors that were going on. Okay, good example. Alrighty, so some context. The U.S. in 1916. Okay, so this is before the war is even, being thought about entering by the United States. Okay, so the U.S. population at the time reacted pretty negatively to the outbreak of World War I. They really, at the time, were quite glad that basically two oceans separated them, the Atlantic on one side and the Pacific on the other. And they really appreciated that it could have this kind of isolationist kind of standpoint. And in some cases, people in the U.S. Certainly expressed the sentiment that they were superior to these kings and related cousins and all the people in Europe whose their monarchies couldn't really control getting in tangles with each other. And so like the U.S. kind of, in this sense, I guess, could perhaps feel a little bit superior. Okay? And many Americans, essentially, Woodrow Wilson being one of them, wished to stay neutral in it. Okay? And indeed, Woodrow Wilson is reelected in 1916, because again, he was elected in the four-way controversial fiasco-ness that was 1912. Okay? And he was actually elected with the slogan in 1916, "He has kept us out of war," or "He kept us out of war." I've heard both. Okay, so that's, as you're going to find, going to be quite ironic. So the thing here is that it's not exactly necessarily that Woodrow Wilson was trying to keep things isolated. There's still a lot of stuff going on in the background. Okay, so part of this context here is that the U.S. was in some ways already setting itself up to pick a particular side before World War I broke out. Okay? And that is because, first of all, Americans lived in a very racial and ethnic hyphenated society. Okay, so people, when they identified themselves, we hear lots of words like German American, Irish American. And so all those identities that are competing with each other in Europe at the time are mentioned a lot. Okay, and so a lot of ethnic identities here are going to be touched upon. And so if we look here from the immigrant standpoint, okay, as if there is such a thing, 13 million immigrants from warring countries, okay, who were in the U.S., most supported Germany because there were roughly about 8 million German Americans and about 4 million Irish Americans. Okay, and both of them, the Irish obviously not liking Britain, and the Germans being on the opposite side of the British, most of these immigrants did not want to side with the Triple Entente, which was Great Britain and the UK. However, more Americans, especially those of English descent, okay, so think about like they would have been, I guess, Republicans at the time, but white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, Woodrow Wilson lent credit out to the different sides at the start of this war. Now, credit, again, is basically giving countries loans, and as you can expect, going to war is quite costly. And so when the United States saw this conflict break out, essentially they kind of became the banker for some of these countries during the wartime. But it's how much they give to certain sides that's interesting. So if we look at Woodrow Wilson's lending of credit, he gave $2 billion out of the roughly $2 billion to the Triple Entente, 99.99%, and only $27 million worth of credit was lent to Germany and the Triple Alliance. That's 0.01%. So clearly, we can see that just on the credit side, the U.S., at least from a government standpoint, seems much more interested in helping out the British. And a future issue, as you're going to see here, that's going to be kind of tied up in this, is that all these ethnicities that are here in the United States, we're going to see a lot of stuff in this next lesson that we're going to do about ethnic loyalties during the war and how that affects the home front. Okay, cool. So, neutrality. Let's talk about subs. Okay? So, again, we're still before end of the war. The U.S. has not gotten to that point yet. So what happened? Well, as the war begins to develop, Britain had blockaded, the German fleet in the North Sea. All right, and if you, and I'll pull up a map of Europe here. Europe. Okay, what a blockade is simply like the Anaconda Plan in the U.S. Civil War. Still need Nicki Minaj to get on making a remix of that particular thing. Okay, but if you can see here on the map, okay, I'm just going to pull this up a little bit larger. Let's find a better one. Okay, so here's the map we can use. What Britain had done essentially was that it had blockaded off a huge section. So this right here, okay, it had blockaded, and then down here it had blockaded. And so it had the German surface fleet in here trapped. Okay, and Germany at this time actually did aid on British shipping, okay, to make sure it could kind of shut down their supply routes. Was an idea that hadn't existed in war yet, and that was the U-boat, the Unterseeboot, so the underwater boat, subs. And so the big change here is that U-boats operate on a completely different principle than surface fleets. Okay, how a submarine has to work, because they're very fragile, and basically you don't want to go toe-to-toe with a battleship if you're in a U-boat, that's on the surface at least, is it's based on surprise, because you use torpedoes, not guns. And so why this changes essentially everything is that before this time, when two surface fleets got into conflict with one another, it was a very, I don't want to say necessarily formal affair, but it was certainly more formal than was about to be. Because, for instance, if there was a passenger vessel that you were going to wipe out, or let's say it was a merchant vessel that you were going to take over, you had to stop them, notify them that you were going to pull up next to them, and notify them that they were about to be fired upon. You would then provide lifeboats and other safety equipment for the passengers to get off the ship. Before then, they would go away and you would sink the ship. But the thing is a U-boat has to operate on surprise. It can't do that. So all of a sudden, Germany begins sinking ships without warning out in the Atlantic Ocean. And why this matters here is because one of these, and as time goes on, more of these ships have Americans on them, or they are American ships. And so one good example early on of this is the Lusitania, which was on its way to Liverpool, Britain. So it came from America. I think it was New York, not totally sure. But it went then across the Atlantic Ocean over to England. And 128 Americans died on board. Now, what's interesting about that is that the ship wasn't exactly neutral. It was claimed to be at the time, but it was actually secretly carrying weapons, ammunition, those kind of things. And so technically, Germany was within its right to sink that ship. So what happens kind of from this point is then the Germany backtracks. Okay, and this was called undeclared submarine, unlimited undeclared submarine warfare. There's a specific term for it that I need to remind myself of. Undeclared submarine warfare? I'm gonna have to look it up. But, anyways, Germany stops the policy for a little bit of time on sinking ships without warning, because the one thing they don't want to do is get the U.S. involved. And then, as time goes on, they realize they have to do something, so they try again with, it's called unrestricted submarine warfare. That's it, unrestricted submarine warfare. So essentially, Germany then begins that again, and they start firing basically on any ship that's heading to the British Isles. And their reasoning is, okay, yes, it might eventually get the United States into the war, but we're going to do maximum damage before that time happens. Okay? And so that is going to contribute to our causes of the war here. And I'm going to find a space for my face. There we go. And it is these 4 things, okay, which we can most commonly point to as some of the big starters of the war. Russia, unity, ships, and telegrams. Rust. Okay? So why all of a sudden am I mentioning Russia? Well, Russia, again, was on the side of the Triple Entente. Okay? But again, the government of Russia was a czar. The person in charge was a czar. It's not a very democratic form of government at all. And so what happened with Russia is by March 1917, the Russians essentially pulled out of World War I for a couple of complicated reasons. Okay? But what this gave at the time was Americans additional motivation that the war could be fought for the idea of democracy. Because again, if you're now going to come onto the side that is fully composed of democracies, Britain, France, okay, that makes you feel a little bit more credible about your team. Okay? And we even see this here, that Woodrow Wilson had this ideal that he was going to make the world safe for democracy. Okay, so Russia isn't just necessarily that Russia pulls out of the war, that we have this motivation here. We have this cause that the United States is embarking upon something greater. Okay, also, the other thing, okay, as we mentioned earlier, many Americans, the Irish and German, did not want to side with the Triple Entente. More Americans, those of English descent, did. Okay, also, Americans restricted that policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. Basically, to define that for you, it's the policy of if the Germans saw it, they sunk it. And they resented that of Germany. And the last thing that really ticked a lot of Americans off was something called the Zimmermann telegram. Now, what the Zimmermann telegram was it was this telegram sent from Zimmermann, who was the essentially the foreign affairs officer for the Germans, and he sent this telegram to Mexico. It was intercepted by the British, who were more than happy to pass it off to the Americans. And what that said, what the Zimmermann telegram said, is that if Mexico attacked the United States, Germany would be, as I lose my slide there, Germany would be more than happy to help the Mexican army reclaim Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and provided a whole bunch of money in its efforts. So again, all these things were taken by the United States during the Mexican-American War. And obviously, the U.S. learning about this, that Germany is going to help take away states that had now existed, at least for a pretty decent while, that were gathered in the Mexican-American War, doesn't exactly make the U.S. very happy. Okay? So these 4 things, Russia, unity, ships, and telegrams, are all going to come together to basically push or help the U.S. fall into World War I. Okay, so there's also one thing that I almost forgot about the Zimmermann telegram that I'm really glad I remembered, that there was actually a second part to it. And I almost forgot about this, so I'm glad I went back and I've re-recorded this now. And that was the Zimmermann telegram, a little part down at the bottom, and this actually in many cases made the U.S. angrier, was that it asked Mexico to convince Japan, who was also in World War I, on the side already of the Triple Entente. It called on Mexico to convince Japan to switch sides and also declare war on the United States. And so again, that just kind of contributes to the whole thing that the Zimmermann telegram really made a lot of people in the U.S. government very upset at Germany. From that point on, you're going to take a look here at trench life for Americans once they go over. Okay, you'll learn about stuff with poison gas, and you have an exit ticket to do.